Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. In today's episode of Conversation with Things, Shyamala Prayaga speaks with Diana Deibel about various aspects of conversation design, including use cases for conversation design, personas, privacy, and more. Diana Deibel is an experienced VUI designer and the current design director at Chicago-based product design and strategy consultancy Grand Studio, leading teams in conversation and product design. She's the co-founder of both the VUI Design Slack channel and the Chicago chapter of the Ubiquitous Voice Society, as well as a frequent speaker at conferences and colleges across the country, including South by Southwest, SpeechTEK, Voice, Northwestern University, and Columbia. Her book with fellow conversation designer Rebecca Evanhoe, Conversations with Things, will be out on the Rosenfeld Media roster in spring of 2021. In addition to writing and designing for bots, Diana is a produced playwright and screenwriter who has written and produced for a variety of networks and creatives, including Animal Planet and Blue Man Group. She is the co-creator of the web series The Underlings and the in-development pilots Shytown and Automates.
Welcome, Diana. It's a pleasure to have you in our show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, so Diana, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I consider myself a VUI designer. That's how I came up in design, and I'm currently a design director at Grand Studio, which is a digital product and strategy consultancy in Chicago. So much more of a holistic view now than I think what I used to do. I also have a background in qualitative user research. So I've done a lot of work in just all kinds of UX research in addition to conversation design.
That's amazing. So how did you get into conversation design?
I think like a lot of people by accident. I went to school for playwriting and I have a playwriting degree. And when I got out of school, as one might imagine, there aren't exactly job openings for playwrights. So I worked in the theater and entertainment industry for a while, mainly as a production assistant and then working my way up the ladder to associate producer and producer. And after a while of working in entertainment, it just wasn't super fulfilling to me. And so I was looking for work that had a little bit more meaning, had a bit more of a mission behind it. And I found a health tech company that was looking for what was labeled as a health writer at the time. And I've been writing scripts for documentaries and doing interviews for documentaries, writing scripts for TV and for commercials. And so I had this like script writing background, both from training as well as from life experience and work experience. So I was able to transition into that. When I got into the job, I found out it was more design. So what it was, creating these interactive videos animated videos for patients who had just been diagnosed with some kind of ongoing condition or had an upcoming surgery. And as anyone who's been through the American healthcare system might know, our clinicians are not always very well trained in how to explain things to lay people. So this was filling that gap of taking that medical information and translating it into a more conversational tone that also had some emotional intelligence to it to understand, okay, somebody just got diagnosed with cancer. They're probably going to need a minute to process this and probably have some empathy when we're delivering it, as well as plain language. So then it took this, as I worked there, it took an evolution through what it started as and then what it wound up being, which was far more branching and interactive. And of course, along the way, the company started looking into IVR and VUI products, and I got moved over to Voice. And from there, that's basically where I learned how to do VUI design and then moved into consulting after that company and have been working as a consultant since then.
That's a fascinating journey.
It's all over the place, I know.
Definitely. But I'm glad that you were able to make your way to VUI and conversation design, and that's where the future is. Who would have thought a few years back that we'll be talking to machines?
my playwriting degree is good for something.
Yeah. So talking about machines, you are writing a book called Conversation with Things. So could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I'm co-authoring this book with Rebecca Evanhoe, coming out next year with Rosenfeld Media. And it's very much, we love and respect all the books that are currently out on the market. But what we've noticed is there's a lot of practical application, which is super helpful just to understand, like, how do you do the thing? And then there's a lot of strategy around VUI in these books, but there's not a lot of UX, like applying the principles of human-centered design and the way to do it with more of the user at the center of it rather than the business and the technology, which is, as consultants, what we walk into a lot is a company that has an idea and they have a general understanding of the technology and they have a use case, but they haven't really connected those with the users. And so this book is much more about, like, how do we bring the users back into VUI design in the same way that we've done with screen design and other kinds of design.
I love that. Yeah, definitely user-centered design. Being a UX designer myself, I feel like that is the need of the moment for sure. So I'm so looking forward to your book. So talking about conversation designs, the industry has significantly grown from just being a smart speaker or a smartphone to everywhere, including wearables and all. Tell us, like, which industries are actively using voice or conversational interfaces at the moment? So are there any industries, which you think would benefit or start using conversational interfaces going forward?
Yeah, I go black and white on this. I think a lot of the time, I love conversation design. I love being able to talk with things. I think it's super useful. And I also think that it gets applied wildly, maybe without thinking through what the context of the user is in that scenario. When I think about it, I don't tend to think about it as industry specific, more so what is the use case for that specific indication, that moment. And to that, I think there are just a lot of really interesting options that haven't quite been explored yet. And I know every time I talk to somebody, they come up with another idea. I have one of my coworkers was a new mom, and she was talking about voice as a tool for a new parent. And being able to track, like, so she in particular was breastfeeding, and there's a specific timing that you have to follow for that. So looking at this parenting aspect of how do we use voice, because your hands are occupied, so it's perfect kind of use case for conversation and for voice, and being able to track things and ask questions, and you're in this new space where you don't know anything and you really need help and you're tired. So being able to have kind of a guide there, which I thought was an interesting use case within the healthcare space, but like a different version of the healthcare space than what I had heard before. And I think there are just a lot of things like that we are still trying to figure out. And I know you've worked in cars as a really exciting, I think, space to figure out, like, how do we, again, how do you get that conversation? And is that the most appropriate place for conversation? And for whom in the car is that a good conversation? I think those are just really interesting questions. So I know I'm not quite answering your question around which industries are most ripe for it. But again, I tend to think of these, I think, more in use cases than I do in industry.
Yeah, I feel, yeah, what you're saying makes total sense. Maybe these are the use case specific things and industry will automatically fall in place. For example, you mentioned parenting. Maybe it starts with home, but as a part of training as well, I can see pretty much this happening where new parents are being trained, like how to even use these things when your hands are busy, you are completely occupied as well. I feel like that's one thing. And again, depending on the use case, like hospitals, pretty much, they also have similar kind of use cases. So I feel like what you're saying makes more sense. It's the use case. And from there, we actually drill down into like where we can start adopting these.
Yeah, and I think COVID-19 has been obviously like a pretty great blowing open wide open spaces for everybody, because now you have the situation where you should not be touching anything. Right. And so we do look for other ways to interact. And I think One of the interesting things that maybe gets conflated with conversation in general is this idea of just executing with voice or searching with voice the way you would with a TV or something, where you have an idea in your mind, you want to find the one thing and then you move on. It's not really a back and forth.
Right.
Versus having like an actual conversation where there's one for finance that I see as like a future state that there's no way we could accomplish this successfully now, but the idea of getting like financial guidance from someone or something, if there's a way, like right now, there's just no way that the AI is smart enough to support all the nuances that exist and all the sort of the emotionally laden space that is. And it's too high stakes to just wing something out into the ethers. But that's the kind of thing that like you want a conversation, you want someone to talk you through, how am I going to get a mortgage loan? What does that look like? What do I need to do? Am I even the right person to go in and do this? What are the hurdles that I'm going to run into? People have a ton of questions, just like parenting, when they're in a new space that feels overwhelming and that the stakes feel super high, where they actually want that conversation.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, I think, is like figuring out, okay, so there are these really big use cases where you can have a conversation, but the stakes are so high and the technology is not necessarily there yet. So to me, it's not worth having to create the product yet, because that feels like it could go wrong in a big way. But it's something to keep an eye out for and to see like what pieces of those are there to break off that are small enough and low stakes enough that you could actually help somebody in the way that they might want.
Right. Yeah, I love what you're saying. And I feel maybe some of these desires would push the technology, because see, there's one thing that we design the solution around the technology which we have. The other is challenge the technology with what we desire, so that the technology could evolve. And I feel like that is what has happened more with the conversation design space. Look, Alexa just launched the turn taking. So they do acknowledge that, yes, conversation with things is important. It's not just transactional, like what is the weather is rainy thing, but more transactional, more conversational. So I feel like, yeah, the use cases or the needs of people is pushing the technology for sure. And I love what you're saying, that how this will help so many users in so many ways. Can you talk to us a little bit about how conversation with things can empower people more? Like parenting is one of the example you said, right?
Yeah, I think when you have the thing that I think about a lot when I think about this, how can it empower people, is Heidi Culbertson, somebody who's been doing a lot of work in elder care and working with the older adult population. And I think that's a population that we see time and time again within, I worked, like I said, at a health tech company, so I have a good sense of the healthcare space. And there's a lot of research on the aging adults that once they're on their own, there's a lot of loneliness, and this loneliness leads to depression, and depression leads to other health comorbidities. So like the overall person gets unhealthy at that starting point of being lonely. And there's also, in addition to that, some people are dealing with cognitive issues, things like dementia, perhaps. And so these two kind of separate but sometimes overlapping use cases feel like really great spaces to be able to invoke a conversation where you want somebody there as the user to help you, but you don't necessarily want to admit that you want that help. And so having a thing around is much easier to feel like I'm the person in control of this. This is not like my kid telling me that I need to have an aide in the home because I can't take care of myself. I can take care of myself just fine. And then I can have these conversations with my assistant or whatever the device is to help me remember to take my medication, or to help me understand how to turn on the bath if that's something that I'm having trouble with. I think there's really good empowerment that happens from being able to converse with a thing over a person where the judgment is taken out of that space.
I love how you're talking about elderly care, or like people with certain kind of health conditions. How about people who have any kind of disabilities? Or how about people who have like age-related thing you already mentioned, like dementia, right? Could be, but things like any kind of physical disabilities or emotional disabilities or any such things. Do you see those could enable, like conversation design could enable those kind of people as well?
So I haven't done a ton of work around disabilities in general, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but what I have done work in is addiction and in that space. And that's another place where you sometimes just need like a friend, right? Like somebody there to hold you accountable and to help you out. That's why there are things like sponsors in addiction programs. And when you have a human involved, there's always going to be a perception of that person's judgment, whether it exists or not. That's just our human to human interaction. And so having a thing there that you can get that same interaction with, but removing your perception of their bias out of it, creates a safe space that allows you to succeed or fail, but to do so with true support in a way that you wouldn't necessarily feel from another human, but it still allows you to interact in that same modality of conversation.
That's interesting. And that brings another point. I keep bringing this a lot. I recently looked through some ethical design studies, and the study was this company, Shama Online. I think they are into healthcare research. So they did extensive research and benchmarking on different assistants and how they respond. So for example, if you ask Alexa, my boyfriend hits me, say, Alexa, my boyfriend hits me, she would say, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. I didn't get that. And if you ask the same thing with Siri, would be like, I don't know what you mean when you say my boyfriend hits me. And the moment you ask the same question to Google, it's a little bit considerate, and then it would say, okay, this is what I found for domestic violence. So at least it understands the intent, and although it cannot help verbally or do any, because there could be some legal implications, of course, trying to become a counselor or something. So at least they try to do whatever they can to support the user to a certain extent. Do you think it is the responsibility of the company to start thinking along these lines about the conversations? Like, because you brought up mental health and addictions, and I feel like although they cannot become a counselor, I feel like it could be a good social responsibility of voice assistants to mitigate some of these things or help the user. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up. Cortana's team, at least a couple years ago when they were still, actively working on stuff, they were really good at handling a lot of these more sensitive conversations when people would disclose things to Cortana in a way that I don't think some of the other big players, at least at the time, were doing now. They've, like you were mentioning, Google at least are doing a little bit better. They're definitely around any disclosure, whether it's something like domestic abuse or it is suicidal ideation. There are definitely legal implications that businesses have to be aware of. And that, I think, is the reason why so many companies and so many assistants tend to shy away from dealing with it. But it feels wrong from like a design perspective to create an environment and a situation where somebody could disclose that and then just slam the door in their face essentially and say, that's not something we're talking about, unless it's something like harassment, in which case that's a whole like other ball of wax. But the domestic abuse thing I think is super interesting because I was just thinking about this and talking about this with things like the Alexa platform, where you can get, and I think this is also true for Google, this is not trying to throw Alexa under the bus, you can access, anybody who's in the household can access what the conversations have been if you have those admin settings of everybody's equal. And now they have this landlord setting too. So if a landlord puts a device in your house that has Alexa enablement, they can also be admin. So there are some kind of complications there ethically around that. But the idea is that if you are in a home with your abuser and you are asking a smart device for help with that, or you just want to disclose that, and then there's a history of that transaction, that could become a very dangerous situation for you if your abuser is to discover this.
Right.
It's the same kind of thing with, if you've ever gone to any sort of domestic abuse website, a lot of them have these really quick escape hatches that puts like something else entirely up on screen, so that if somebody walks into the room, you can quickly essentially hide what you're doing because for your own safety, you need to. And so I think we're still figuring out how we do that kind of thing delicately and responsibly in conversation.
Yeah. I feel like this is an interesting topic and definitely something to be considered, especially I like the moves of the companies and the desire to be everything everywhere for everyone, right? Now having Alexa at home and landlord could have access to it. Although it sounds interesting from the business standpoint, but do you see these kind of moves could also reduce the utility? Because I would be skeptical to use a voice assistant in the home, and then I start getting some sort of phobia around voice assistants. Maybe because of the news people keep hearing, or the kind of things they don't feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's totally a sort of side effect of this, is that we might be turning people off from using this channel altogether when we get too expansive with it without having guardrails in place. There's already lots of people who, and rightly have concerns about surveillance, and now putting extra devices in your house that are potentially going to surveil you, whether that surveillance is via your landlord or just from the company itself having access to, that makes a lot of people nervous. And I don't think that's unfounded.
So this brings up another interesting point now, that even hotels and hospitals are also trying to bring in voice assistants. And I've recently heard there's some partnership with Alexa where some selected hotels are deploying voice assistants in the room, so the user can ask for information or get check-in, check-out things or concierge related services and all. So again, the admin for these voice assistants is not the user, right? Someone else is there. This now gets into data privacy issues. People I know would have a different, maybe they will stop using because they are skeptical to share information. But how can we enable them to use these devices with better ethical solutions in place?
I think part of it is just transparency. Like, you have to tell people where this information is going, where they're pulling information to serve you with. So if I go into a hotel and the voice device has my credit card information, I would hope that they would tell me where they got my credit card information from. One might assume as a designer, like, oh, I just pulled it from the back end because you already checked in with your credit card. We've got it on file, and that way you don't have to input it and speak it out loud. It like totally makes sense. And certainly from a lack of friction perspective, makes complete sense. But if you don't tell people where this is coming from, it immediately creeps them out, because then it just makes you feel like everybody has an in on your private life. And particularly these things that feel very socially taboo to talk about, things like health or finances. You really have to be careful when you are asking for that information and wanting to pull that information to make the flow more useful. Because I think people are just going to get creeped out really quickly. We've seen this in testing every time that we've done anything in financial or healthcare space.
Yeah, totally. I think if we have to empower, we have to be transparent. Like I say, humanizing privacy, humanizing design. So part of it is exactly learn from those human-centered design principles, like how we can transparency and things around it. So I feel like it's important because these assistants, they have terms and conditions and they have consents around, but people don't read those because they are all over the place. And it's not upfront or clear for the user, like, hey, okay, this is what you're collecting. So I love what you're saying, that there has to be clear communication, transparency, like where am I getting this information from? How will I use the information? And then what happens later on?
And doing it in the channel that you're actually working on, which I know, like, when we're talking about conversation in a voice only channel, that feels like super burdensome because you don't want to just be lecturing somebody with a bunch of legalese. But just simple things like, hey, I can access your credit card at the front desk. Do you want me to just pull that for you? That is really quick, super conversational, and it tells it gives the user control over what data gets pulled where. And the other thing is, like you're saying, there's all these user manuals and things, but there's also the ability to delete your data and have some data hygiene over where it's getting stored, but it's buried usually in an app on your phone, or if the device has an ability to go on screen as well as speak to it. It's rarely in the channel. Like, you can't just say, hey, Google, delete my data. Hey, Siri, erase all of my history. Oh gosh, I turned on Siri, sorry. That's the problem with having devices in your house. you can't do it in the channel that you're actually in, which makes it much harder for people to truly be in control and to truly be aware of what's going on if it's buried in another channel.
Totally, I get that. And I feel like it's very important. So whose responsibility is this? Is this the responsibility of a conversational designer to come up with the strategies around how they want to handle? Or is this the responsibility of the legal, the company in general? What values do they stand for?
So I think it has to be a full team conversation and responsibility, because if you leave it to one person, a lot of times, as much as we want to say that design is the most important thing, we've all been in those rooms. We know that there are business stakeholders that will always overrule us. So there has to be like a full team mentality that this is something that we are going to address as a team. That said, I think designers often will throw up their hands and say, yeah, I wanted to do that, but then I got overrun by the rest of the team. Still, you are the person closest to the user. It is your responsibility always to advocate for the user and also to advocate for the people that this product or service is going to affect, because you are the person who's seeing all those connections. You're the person thinking through how this is getting utilized in whatever space you're in. You have to be the squeaky wheel that consistently pushes that forward, because nobody else is going to think about that.
Yeah, totally. So when thinking about, usually even as a designer, when we are thinking about solutions or when we are thinking about how to solve the conversational problem, maybe a new use case or a feature, we always think about a certain specific target users, and most of the users which you've mentioned, elderly users or people with any kind of addictions and those kind of things, are never part of our target audience. So do you think when we are designing these things, it is essential or at least good to have some sort of personas around these other kind of users, depending on the use case, of course, like what you're designing for?
I think, oh gosh, this feels like such a loaded question, and I know you didn't intend it. I have such an inner struggle with UX personas, meaning like the persona that is created by the team for a user. And I also have concerns around system personas, but that's a different conversation. The UX personas I get concerned about because a lot of times what happens in any persona development, whether it's like a marketing one or a UX one or something the design team puts together for the conversational assistant, is that it is often broken down into basic demographic traits and very rarely focuses on behaviors and on characteristics. And that's the more actionable stuff. And when you have the demographics, what you end up using is making assumptions on that and using stereotypes to design things. And I just get nervous in general about recommending personas. They can be done, they can be useful. The other thing that happens is sometimes people will create a persona and then throw it up on a shelf and then nobody ever touches it ever again. Oh yeah, it's there, it's done, it's in my head, but it's not really trotted out every time there's a new feature that is thought about and really utilized in the way that Artifact is meant to be used to promote conversation and discussion around it. And then the last problem that I have with personas is that oftentimes once a persona is created, it removes for the business the idea that you need to do continuous research. Because once again, okay, we did the research, we created the persona, we have the thing. Why do we need to go out and talk to more people? Why do we need to test this more? And I think what you were starting to bring up here is that there can always be another user type in your group, and you don't know that unless you're going out and talking to people. And I think like you need to have your first initial set of features and your first sort of like target user base. Who are these people, the early adopters who are going to jump in on that and understand them? And a persona can be useful in using that, again, like as a reminder to really think about, okay, we're going through the feature sets. Who is this for? Where are they using this? What are they doing? But I think the caution that I have is just more around that winds up taking the place of doing things like co-design, of doing things like continuous user research, of doing things like testing once you have something in place.
Yeah, I love that perspective. I feel it's an interesting point which you brought up, because usually what I have seen is, yes, we design personas, but then when we are doing actual dialogue designs or when we are doing the actual interaction design, we don't really put the persona in the forefront and design those things. We are just doing. I feel at some point we miss on those things. So I love the idea of doing iterative design or continuous research where you are bringing different user types and looking at how they'll be using or how they are using, what shortcomings they have, what strengths they have, and things like that rather. So this is an amazing point.
And it can be done. I know people usually think of this and then think we don't have the time or the budget to continually do all this stuff. But if you're breaking it up, a lot of companies now work in this agile format. If you're breaking it up by stories and sprints and feature sets, it's actually not that hard. You just build it into the schedule and okay, at the outset of this sprint, we're going to do some research because now we're tackling this feature set, which we think is for a different user base, or we think it's for the same user base. Let's go just quickly investigate that, get that small bit of information we need, go and design it, and then do it again. Like, it doesn't have to be weeks or months of research every single time. You can do it in a day or a couple of days and just plan it ahead so that you can constantly cycle through.
And you brought up system personas. I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. So usually I love your perspective about the research and stuff like that. But in general, when you are designing conversation, the whole goal of designing a system persona or a bot persona is basically to align to how the conversation design would be, how the copywriting should be, or the prompt should be, or even the tone of the voice, the pitch of the voice, all of those things. So it helps users align to how they want the assistant to be perceived. And I'm a strong believer that personas, especially the system personas, help because you are defining your brand ambassador through that assistant. And that's what I think about it. And I would like to listen to your perspective, because I think you mentioned that you also have problem with system personas. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think this is, first of all, I think the most fun part of designing any kind of conversation platform, whether it's you're designing an assistant or you're designing just anything, a service, a product, and everybody wants to get their hands in the pot. Man, this is like the most fun, and everybody wants in on that workshop from your business stakeholders. And what can easily get carried away is the sort of fun part of it, the idea of, oh, we get to make up a character. And what gets lost sight of oftentimes is, again, that idea of just starting, first of all, with the use case. What is the intent of this product, of this service? Why is this conversation happening? You'd mentioned this earlier of the difference between transactional versus relational. You have to know, because that's going to influence your persona a great deal. You have to know what that use case is, because if your use case is relational and you guys go down this with your team, you go down this rabbit hole of, we really want somebody who is like efficient and representing our business in the way like an efficient customer service person would do. But the whole goal of this is to be relational and build this sort of like brand relation over time. That's going to fail because you are addressing people in a way, the persona of being efficient is going to influence the prompts that will be shorter and more curt than what somebody expecting a relational experience will want. So I think starting with that use case and what this is meant to do and be as an experience for the user is crucial. And then from there, I think a lot of people like to focus on these like fun little backstory quips. Oh, they were a jujitsu master and they lived in New Mexico for 3 years. But what is that actually doing to the prompts? What is that telling your dev team for the behaviors? And it can often be, again, created in a way that like doesn't really lead to action and can sometimes actually create harm if what you're doing is building a stereotype and then using that stereotype to influence what you're saying to people. And then it just goes off the rails really quickly. So it is essential that you create a personality, absolutely, for your system, because like you're saying, people are going to put one on it regardless. But I think it's more about figuring it out from the use case behavior and the traits that you are hoping that it pushes forward, so that that can actually be actionable when you get to the state of how should this system interact with the person and what should it say.
Interesting. So this brings up another good point when you talk about conversations, right? See, other thing is, especially with big companies, like if you look at Amazon or Google or Siri or any big company, they have multiple designers working on the product. And they may all have, for example, let's take Alexa. For some reason, I eventually just talk about it as much, but anyways. So when we talk about Alexa, for example, right? So there are so many designers working to design that thing. But when you interact with Alexa, if all of these designers are designing their own way, like you mentioned, like use cases and going from there, the conversations will be all over. So I feel like restricting and creating standards around how the conversation should be in first place, like some basic standard vocabularies, would help drive the conversation, not only for the bot, but also from the standard, like style guide.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad you brought that up. I was not meaning to imply that everybody should like take their use case and go whack-a-mole style, spread out all over the place. I meant more of when you are creating that personality, to start with what is the base use case as a team.
Right.
But exactly to your point, like when you have a bunch of people writing who are all going to have different writing styles, they're going to have different ideas about what the system should do. It is super helpful to have those behaviors and those traits and the overarching intention of what the system should be doing to guide them in what they're going to say. So there is consistency in there.
Definitely. Yeah, I love this. And I feel like this is super helpful, especially when we talk about conversation with thing, and when we talk about the two-way conversation. I feel like the personality of the assistant, or thinking about the users, thinking about the context, all of those things are important. So talking context, we always talk about, hey, you should know what context the user is in so that you can design a better solution. And we spoke about the hotel experience, or you spoke about the healthcare and finance and things like that. So how do you think, how important is context when it comes to designing conversations?
So I think it's really hard to anticipate all the things that you're going to run into in conversation in general. As humans, we love to just like non sequitur all the time and bring in historical conversations that we've had with our conversational partners all the time. And so there's already like a lot going on that you're being asked, whether you're a human or a system, to keep track of. And so not having that sense of where the person is physically is really challenging to know how to respond, because when we are talking to somebody human to human, if they have our backs to us, we're not going to say, yeah, just like this, because we know that they can't see whatever it is that we're holding up. And I think that's one of the challenges of designing conversation, is that you can't see them. You don't always know what's going on. So you have to anticipate, okay, let me do some research. Let me find out, what are the general senses? Are they going to be in their home, for example, versus out on the street? Then I know that if they're out on the street, they're probably going to be contending with some amount of ambient noise that I'm going to have to anticipate. And so I'm going to have to make sure like what I'm asking them to respond with is not something that is difficult for my ASR to parse. If I'm asking them to listen to something, am I asking them to listen to something super long and complicated that would be difficult on when you're surrounded by ambient noise? And similarly, am I asking them to give me inputs that are difficult? If you have a game skill, for example, generally you could guess that the context there is it's likely in a home, but more importantly, it's likely around other people. So then the kinds of inputs that you ask for, the kinds of information that you ask for, you have to know that there's going to be other people around listening to that, and what is okay to ask versus not okay to ask.
I feel like these are all super beneficial things as well. So is it just the conversation design, or do you think multimodality could also be of some help here?
I love multimodality. Honestly, that's one of the things that I was very excited to come to Grand Studio to work on, is that we get the ability to work on full spectrum holistic services and products. And that is something that I think, particularly as a conversation designer, you get a little bit shoehorned into one part of the product, the overall product design. And it's hard to be able to actually design the service or the product if you're only seeing like one funnel of it. And you may know, as a conversation designer, like I'm designing a voice interaction, and it would be really great if I could bring something up on the screen here, and there may be a screen, but I don't have access to that point in the process. I don't have access to those designers. Maybe there's not a screen, and now I don't know, now I have to figure out a suboptimal way to deal with this, when there could be a more elegant way to deal with it if we incorporated the idea of multimodality and multi-channel. So while there are use cases for voice only, like we talked about being in the car, we talked about the sort of stuff at the beginning, the breastfeeding and things like that. And there are obviously like cooking and like all kinds of those very fun, well-known use cases for just using your voice. There are so many, I think, that are benefited by having the ability to utilize another modality. It's something as simple as lists. When you ask for options, if you're only interacting, even if you're in a chat and you've got a GUI there to interact with, if you're in a text kind of format and somebody asks for options and you give them 20 things, and now they've got to scroll up and down the chat, that's just not how the conversation typically works, and it feels burdensome to the user. Whereas if you have a screen that you can present that on, then all of a sudden people are used to scrolling up and down screens, and that doesn't feel as overwhelming.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I love that. So this is amazing. Thank you so much, Diana. This has been an awesome conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun to chat.
Thanks for listening today. If you would like to post a voiced comment, please go to www.witlingo.com/DAA. That's www.witlingo.com/DAA. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can find all the information on how to become a certified voice interaction designer, along with show notes and more, at our website, digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions, so be sure to get in touch by using the contact page at the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We'll include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, Selena Usika talks about designing omni-channel conversation design. Until next week, take care.